There is a sound that used to make my stomach drop like an elevator with snapped cables, and for 16 years I have been proud to say I never heard it again inside my walls. It is the rattle of a car bumper against a mail slot, the hollow thunk of someone knocking with the casual entitlement of a person who believes they own your life. I start this because I'm a storyteller by habit and trade, because I post these things on Reddit and people read them and sometimes they help me sort the truth. I do not start this to brag. I start it because the fortress I built around my life has felt indestructible for a long time, and I want you to see what I built, how carefully, how imperfectly, before it becomes important again. My house is small, with one crooked step and a porch light that buzzes when it rains. I bought it with cash I earned from my hands after years of scraping and learning to be useful in a world that likes practical things. I am a carpenter by day and a night storyteller by habit. I fix other people's shelves and then come home and build small things for myself, a cutting board, a chair, a bird feeder. Each object is a tiny proof that I exist and that I can mend. My living room smells like cedar and coffee, and the dog I rescued from the shelter who sleeps like a stone at my feet. There is a bookshelf that leans because I filled it with the wrong things in the wrong order, a testament to an ongoing life rather than some showroom perfection. My kitchen table has a ring where a mug once sat too long, and that ring is a map of the nights I survived one breath at a time. Peace does not mean the absence of memory. Peace means the absence of terror. For me, peace was the sound of my front door unlocking and a hand that belonged to me turning the knob. It was the silence that followed when the television turned off and I didn't have to check the living room to make sure there wasn't someone else watching me. It was a job with predictable hours and tips enough to buy the plants I keep alive on my windowsill, and a therapist who taught me how to name the fear in the small hours. It was the decision to stop answering old phone numbers and to move 1,000 miles away when I was 18 and had nothing but a duffel bag and the determination not to go back. You should know what I ran from. I keep the details tight because they still bruise, but I will give you the edges. My parents were not monsters in the movies. They were people who taught me to be small. My father had a voice like a closing garage and hands that measured worth by how loudly they could hit a table. My mother learned to make her eyes look soft while she did the worst damage, the slow erasure of confidence that comes from having your opinions ridiculed until you parrot theirs to survive. There were belts, yes, and slammed doors, but the worst parts were quieter. The rules that meant love arrived only when I obeyed, the way they rewrote every memory so I was always the problem. I learned to apologize before I knew why. I learned to mute my wants. I learned to stay small. The first time I walked away, I thought I was running to the end of the earth. I was running to the mean little apartment I could afford on tips and bookstore hours. I took a job with a contractor who showed me how to measure and how to take pride in angles. I learned to laugh without waiting for permission. For 16 years I answered to myself. I paid my own bills. I learned what it felt like to be proud of a bill paid on time. I learned how to trust a hand that was not always cutting me down. I taught myself how to cook a roast that did not taste like survival food but like Sunday, even if it was Thursday. There are practical things in my fortress that speak to my recovery. A chain on my bedroom door that clicks in the silence, a list of emergency contacts taped to the inside of a drawer, a therapist's phone number written in my wallet. There are softer things too, a jar of letters I never sent, moments where I allowed myself to stay in love and not run. I have friends who know my story and did not flinch when I told it. Marcus, who lives 2 blocks over and calls me at odd hours with his own drama, has been a kind of witness. He once sat on my porch with a beer and said, "I don't think they get what you are now," and I said, "Neither do I," and we laughed like people who had survived the same storm. Sometimes late, I still flinch at certain phrases. There is a cadence to my breathing when someone raises a voice. There is a scar on my forearm that catches light in a way that reminds me not every wound is visible. I plan my life the way a mason plans a wall, stone by stone, with mortar to bind and here and there a course that looks wonky but holds because the whole thing holds. I am not healed. I am not who I would have been without the bruises, but I am stronger than the small boy who thought silence would save him. I sleep under a roof that I paid for. I have a job that rewards craft, an honest bank account, friends who show up with casseroles when something is rough. I tell you all this because I want the picture to be clear before anything else comes crashing into it. Because when a fortress sits undisturbed for years, people assume it will always stand. I assumed that too. I believed that the door I kept locked would keep out the past. I believed that silence would be enough. And sometimes the worst thing you can believe is that the world will remember the rules you made for it. If I am honest, when I go to bed these days, I sometimes replay the sound of the door in my head and imagine different endings. I never dreamed that the script I rehearsed would need to be acted out for real, but I am careful now. I know my defenses. I have practiced my voice. I know how to say no out loud and mean it. I tell stories on the internet for strangers to listen to, and I like to think I'm good at pulling a reader along until the punchline hits. For once, the punchline is not for you. It is for them if they ever come back. The night was ordinary in the way ordinary nights should be. I had just taken the roast out of the oven, the smell of rosemary filling the small rooms like something honest and unavoidable, and the dog was dreaming on the rug, paws twitching as if chasing ghosts that were not mine. I had a book in my lap and a beer sweating on the table. Marcus had called earlier with some nonsense about a promotion, and I had laughed until my ribs hurt. The porch light hummed, the kind of gentle domestic noise that used to mean safety. I was halfway through the third paragraph of a story I intended to post when the knock at the door landed like a bell tolling in a church I thought closed. It was the knock that owned a century, a slow, authoritative rap that assumed permission. For a second I froze because the sound unspooled everything I had carefully coiled up. My hands went tight around the book, pages bending. The dog lifted his head, tail a metronome of confusion. I walked to the peephole because I had built the habit of looking first, of guarding the little kingdom I had spent years raising like a stubborn sapling. Through the glass, I saw them standing with the confidence of people who believe the world owes them a room. They looked older, yes, the years had folded their faces in the expected ways. My mother's cheekbones had a new sharpness, my father carried a stoop like a problem he refused to name. But the entitlement was the same, like a suit that still fit their posture. I opened the door because my voice in the doorway felt at that second like the only thing between a past and the life I had built. They did not wait. My mother smiled the practiced smile I had practiced shutting down as a child, the one that said I am kind and you are wrong for feeling anything else. My father leaned on the jamb as if he had always owned the threshold. He was thinner than the photo in my head, his fingers were knuckled, but his eyes, those familiar, cold eyes, still slid over me like inventory. They had a suitcase between them and a folded blanket that smelled faintly of cigarettes and motel soap. My heart did that ancient stutter, a fist wanting to make a fist. What hit first was not the memory of belts or slaps that came after. What hit first was the gaslight in their tone. My mother launched into small talk about travel and how wild it was to be back in town, as if we were neighbors running into each other at the grocery store. My father asked about the job with that casual curiosity that once meant a test. They spoke like people who had taken a wrong turn into someone else's life and meant to make themselves comfortable. There was a phrase my mother used, "You always were dramatic, you know, delivered with syrup and affection that tasted like poison." I felt the old shrink of my gut that screamed apology before I knew why. Seeing them made the floor drop out from under the life I have spent years leveling. Memory attacked in small, precise flashes. My father's voice counting mistakes like currency, my mother's quiet corrections that were more correction of me than of anything I said aloud. I could almost hear the echo of doors slamming in apartments we had never left. A coat hanger on a closet suddenly meant a thing I no longer let into the house. The dog rose, body alert, hair tinting up along the spine. Instinct recognized a threat memory had not allowed in years. Rage and fear braided in my chest, anger at the audacity of their arrival and fear that the old weather would find a way back into the roof I had built. They noticed the pictures on the wall, the small handmade shelf I had nailed myself, and interpreted everything as evidence of my success. My mother touched a picture frame like proof of family and said, "You did well, look at you," as if my entire history could be summarized in a 30-minute tour of the living room. My father laughed once, a sound that used to make my spine shorten. When I told them they couldn't stay, I expected shock, silence, maybe an argument. What I did not expect was their blanket apology cadence. "Oh, sweetheart, we are so tired, it's been hard, we just need a place for a while," packaged like a plea but delivered like a decree. They spoke of lost jobs and health and how they'd been alone, their language crafted to weaponize sympathy. The wave of old emotions wasn't a single thing. It was a catalog. Humiliation for the years I had spent shrinking, the fury for the years I had been kept small, and the almost comical absurdity of these two human beings walking into my little house with the same assumptions that had once allowed them to decide who I would be. I could feel the therapist's voice in my head, name the feeling, name the boundary, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was raw and immediate. No. It surprised me how steady it sounded. My mouth formed the word before my throat tightened. Their faces flickered, surprised for half a second, not because I had denied them, but because I had a firmness they had forgotten existed. They did not fold. Instead, my father straightened as if my no were a temporary inconvenience, and my mother's smile went tight. They began to talk about logistics, about needing to get their things out of storage, about how they'd thought to call and hadn't, about all the practical reasons they had for arriving unannounced. They treated me like a helpful neighbor rather than the son they had taught to apologize for being alive. Those words struck a different place than memory, an indignation that said, I built this house without you and I will not let you move into it by command. Fear was there too, humming under the anger, but my refusal, once spoken, had the flavor of a new kind of armor. It fit, and it fit right. They did not ask to come in. They shoved their suitcases past the threshold like they were planting flags. My mother went straight for the foyer light and flipped it on as if she owned the wiring. My father stepped over the rug like it was an old debt he did not intend to pay. The air changed the second they crossed the line. It went from my quiet, measured breathing to a pressure that made my chest ache the way it used to when I held my hands up and waited to be judged. They walked through the rooms like inspectors at an estate sale, naming everything they did not approve of with the casual cruelty of people who measure worth by how closely it matches their taste. My mother sniffed near the bookcase and said, You really keep all this junk. Her voice was soft, but it landed like a slap. She picked up a wooden bowl I had carved and balanced it in her hand like it was a prop. Your hands should have made something respectable, she said, and when I looked at her with the slow hardness I save for bad nights, she smiled and told me I was dramatic again. My father opened the kitchen cupboard and made a face at the mismatch of plates. Back then, that face meant the consequence was about to arrive. Now it meant orders. You never did get it together, he told me, loud enough that the people 2 doors down might hear if they were paying attention. He tapped a finger against the table as if counting the years he believed he had owned me. They went to the fridge like they'd always been allowed to open it and take what they wanted. My mother pulled out the roast I had been saving for myself, pressed the meat, and said, This will do for now. She set it on the counter and began to slice into plans the way she once sliced into my pride. My father found my tool bag and started listing things I should have bought better. Do you still work for that contractor? He asked with a sneer I remembered from childhood, as if my fingers, calloused and steady, were a shame he could name. When I told him I was a lead carpenter now that I managed my own projects, he shrugged and said, Anyone can build a bookshelf. His dismissal was shorthand for everything he had said to me for years. You are small and that would be fine, don't make waves. They ignored the 16-year gap like it was a smudge that would come off with a wet cloth. They spoke of their own troubles the way abusers always do, as if their problems were the weather and everyone else was obliged to take shelter. We have no place to go, my mother said, voice thick with what I learned to call performative suffering. We lost the apartment, my father added, slowed like a confession to bait a guilt hook. They had stories about banks, about health insurance, about a neighbor who took advantage of them, and a landlord who was a monster. The real twist was how swiftly the stories converged on me. We just need a room for a while, my mother said, and the while never had an end in their mouths. They began to catalog the things in my life they found unacceptable. The dog, they said, was too noisy, too wild, and the dog looked at them like he knew they smelled of old storms. Friends who might come by were criticized before their faces appeared. Marcus, my friend with the bad timing, must have been a bad influence, they said out loud, as if loyalty itself was a defect. Even my jar of unsent letters, the ones that held the small confessions I had never showed anyone, was lifted by my mother like contraband and peered into with a sneer. She read a line and laughed softly, the laugh that made me imagine every apology I had swallowed being returned to me as evidence of my failure. As the night wore on, their ambush became bolder. My father produced a gum-stained notepad from his jacket and began to make a list that he read like a legal claim against my hospitality. They spoke of moving in next week, of selling their few remaining things, of how convenient it would be to have someone to drive them to appointments. The audacity of it was obscene. They had unfolded blankets and left their shoes in my hall as if the house had already accepted them. When I asked them to leave until we discussed anything, my mother clutched her chest and nearly swooned onto the couch, making a little scene of frailty that had always worked on people who did not see the pattern. My father muttered about back problems and the cost of motels, the kinds of details meant to polish a case for why I should sacrifice my life for theirs. They tried to recruit the world. My mother called my aunt from my landline like a missionary, spinning the tale of estranged children and benevolent suffering. She painted me as cold, as cruel, as someone who had made a choice to cut them out. The words were quicksand they tried to drag my past under. I could feel old instincts crawling back, the ones that would have solved the problem by apologizing until my voice broke. Instead, I walked in the middle of my living room and measured my response before I spoke. I told them calmly that they could not stay. My father laughed at that word and said, So you'll throw us out now? That laugh was the same sound that had once meant a punishment was coming. They moved my art off the walls to make space for their pictures. They refolded my blankets into neat rectangles as if neatness was their proof of worth. They tried to claim the spare bedroom, moving in their battered mattress like a new territory. When my hand went up to stop them, my mother said, with the sweetest cruelty, "You always were so sensitive." The invasion had 1,000 small cuts. Privacy violated, possessions surveyed and judged, the narrative of my life rewired on the spot by two people who had spent a decade pretending not to exist. They had come back not as children seeking shelter but as conquistadors of my calm, and by midnight my house felt crowded with claimants, and the shape of my hard-won peace bent like a tree in wind. They sat on my couch like a couple who had rehearsed grief into charisma, my mother smoothing the throw with a practiced melancholy, and my father folding his hands like a man reading a script he had written about himself. We started talking like people who share weather reports, and then the weather turned into a sermon. They spoke about the last 16 years as if a thick fog had rolled over them and erased everything that ever went wrong. We drifted apart, my mother said, eyes shining with a manufactured softness, and I felt like I had been hit with a word that had been used against me for years: dramatic. They painted a picture of a family who had been split by accidents and misfortune, not by cruelty. They told me about missed rent checks and a landlord who was unreasonable, about my father's bad knee and my mother's health scares. They mentioned a bankruptcy that had gutted their savings and a scam that had taken their retirement, details that smelled faintly of truth when delivered in monotone sorrow. They had receipts and a stack of paperwork they slid across my coffee table with the arrogance of people who expect sympathy as payment. There were medical bills, discharge slips, and their names on a hospice referral letter. The artifacts were a kind of currency, and for a moment I watched them trade with my empathy like old con artists. But the real weapon was their version of history. My mother had phrases that rewrote whole years in one breath. "We did our best," she said. "We raised you with standards, as if standards were a kindness and not a cage." My father nodded and said, "You chose your friends over family," as if picking a life away from them was a crime I had committed deliberately instead of a necessary escape. The words were slicked with memory grease, easy to slide over the jagged truths I held inside. They did not say the nights of being called worthless. They did not say the way my trophies were used as proof that I was ungrateful. They rewound years and then played a different scene entirely, one in which I was the one who had betrayed them. At first I watched because shock sometimes anchors you to the floor. I listened to them rename every old bruise. A belt strap became discipline administered for my own good. A slammed door became an argument that simply escalated. My mother described the night my father had broken a chair as a tragedy caused by my adolescent rebellion. Every scar they had once inflicted became a lesson. When I tried to correct them, to say that is not how it happened, my voice felt small and legalistic, like someone arguing for a song on the radio while the DJ rewrites the playlist. They were skilled at omissions. They left out the evenings my mother sat in the doorway with a cigarette and a look that made me apologize for breathing. They left out the times my father counted mistakes out loud like beads through a rosary. They left out the way I learned to edit my feelings so I would not set off another storm. It was astonishing to watch how quickly a life could be doctored if you chose only to show the receipts that supported your version. They had crafted a narrative of steadfast love interrupted by fate. Their faces asked me to fold myself into pity, to let that pity be the bridge across 16 years. My stomach tightened around old language. Gaslighting used to drip from their mouths like water in a leaky faucet, slowly, persistently. They said I was the one who turned away, that they had called and sent letters. For a second I let the panic rise. Perhaps somewhere there had been an address I changed, a voicemail missed. Then I remembered the shoebox in my closet, the unsent letters I had written to them the first year I left, letters I had kept as a record of the reasons why I could not go back. I pulled the box out without realizing I was moving, opened a page, and read a fragment aloud about the dinners that ended with a belt. My mother smiled when I read it as if the words were stage props, and told me that I must have misunderstood how she meant things. They were patient the way predators are patient. My father offered to help me with work, to get me jobs with people he knew, like a man offering charity and control at once. My mother spoke about family dinners, about grandchildren she imagined I would give them, tacking allusions like postcards to the conversation. They assumed my life was a resume they could add themselves to. Their revision was not just lies, it was a theft of continuity. They wanted to plug their absence into my present and call it reconciliation. The audacity stunned me because the past had been my scaffolding, theirs would corrode it. Anger and grief braided in me until I could taste iron. Part of me wanted to explode with everything I had cataloged in safe rooms and therapy sessions. Another part of me wanted to walk out and lock the door and phone the police and never see them again. I kept breathing pinch by pinch, calling silence into my mouth like a practice. I knew their tricks because I had learned them by being the target. They were rehearsed in how to turn every blame toward me and away from themselves. The shock was not just that they lied. It was that they believed the lies they were telling, or at least believed that they could make others believe them. I felt smaller watching them conspire to remake our history. There was a moment when my father held up a photograph of my childhood, sun-bleached and smiling, and said, "See, we were a happy family then." It should have been altarpiece evidence, but I remembered that same photograph the afternoon it was taken, the silence after the camera clicked and the weight of hands I had not consented to. The image meant different things to each of us, and that was the point of their campaign. They wanted me to hand them the meaning of my life like a check. I did not hand it to them. I did not know what I would do next, but even stunned, I felt the newness of my own voice waiting like a weapon behind my teeth, and the knowledge that I did not have to accept the story they were selling. They dropped the bomb like a fruit from a tree you thought was yours. It started small, the way they always softened the landing with stories, but it landed hard and left a bruise. My mother began with a cough and a sob, and then the facts slid out. Eviction notices, collections, a bank account cleaned by a relative who had a talent for convincing people to help, a trailer sold for less than they needed, and a foreclosure that had finally finished them. My father said the words without looking up from the spare room doorway, as if reading a script he believed would move me toward charity instead of urgency. "We have nowhere else," he said, and then, as if punctuation were needless, "we will be moving in." They had already chosen the room. They did not ask, they announced. The spare room had been the one place in the house where I kept things I was still repairing, an old dresser that needed new dovetails, the shoebox of letters, the framed concert ticket from the first time I felt like I had a life not designed by anyone else. My parents stood in the doorway and unrolled plans in their head like blueprints of entitlement. My mother clapped her hands like a real estate agent who had just found the perfect buyer and said, "It will be lovely with a new bed." My father had found a worn mattress in their suitcase and dragged it to the center of the room as if deposition were over and possession had begun. They fluffed the pillows like people arranging a tableau they already owned. They spoke of logistics, the way an invading force discusses borders. My mother talked about where the television would go and whether she could reupholster my guest chair. My father mentioned how convenient it would be to keep their insulin in my fridge and to use my address for bills and doctors. They had the audacity to speak in terms of convenience and community. "You can help us with appointments, dear. We will pay you back when the lawyer calls," without the smallest recognition that for 16 years I had survived precisely by not being at their mercy. They had a way of couching demand in gentle phrases that made me want to retch. Then came the line designed to split a grown man's chest into neat wedges. "You owe us," my mother said, and her voice turned syrupy and old as if it had been aging to perfection. "We raised you," she said, as if raising someone were tantamount to buying a mortgage on their future. There were no apologies in the claim, no admission that the years were empty of kindness, just terms. There was also a curious confidence in my father's tone, a smugness I recognized from old interrogations. He assumed I would fold, like I had folded when I was 10 and 30 and every time in between. He did not understand that I had practiced no until it was a muscle. They had already begun to plan the erosion. My mother's fingers made a list aloud. "We can sell some of our things, you can take the dog for walks, you can use the spare room desk for your writing, and we will keep the bills under our name until you help." They removed the small lock from the inside of the closet door like they were stripping me of secrets. I pictured them sifting through the shoebox of letters, my chronicles of escape, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the night. The audacity of deciding which of my possessions would become theirs felt like an assault on ownership itself. My father picked up one of my tools, an old plane I had smoothed by hand for months, and his face softened as if memory softened the cruelty. He said, "You always like to work with your hands, boy," and then suggested he could teach me proper trades that pay. It was a necklace of backhanded compliments that had once come looped with threats. He moved through my life with the practiced ease of someone who thinks correcting is an act of love. I lay my palm against the door frame and felt the grain of the wood like a pulse. Marcus had taught me how to draft boundaries like plans. Say the time and mean it, he had told me once over cheap pizza. The room above my head where they wanted to sleep had been the place I stitched myself back together after the first months away. It held the proofs of me, the chair built for no one but me to sit in and think, the old radio that had taught me to love music without censorship, the jar of coins from my first real pay. They were arranging futures over my proofs like decorators with a theme, entitlement. They spoke of moving in next week as if next week were a small step. They had already arranged for a handyman to help them set up, a man my father claimed to know from a past job whose assistance would only be a favor. They imagined my calendar rearranged around their appointments, my Sundays given to their errands, my bank account a backstop for their bills until their paperwork came through. The word paperwork was a cudgel. It sounded official and temporary, and therefore an easy lever to pry my patience apart. And then my mother, with a smile that had never reached her eyes in an honest way, said the line that almost undid me. "We were thinking you could sign some papers to make this easier." It was a seduction wrapped in legal convenience, a way to trap kindness under the weight of obligation. I pictured a power of attorney, a change of address, a quiet paperwork trap that could bleed a life dry. The room smelled of motel soap, tobacco, and the faint metallic note of their imagined paperwork. I was stunned in a way that was physical. My throat felt thick, my vision narrowed like a lens focusing on the smallest cruelties. I had kept a life from their reach for 16 years, and now here they were, chipping at the mortar with the same expectation as if I owed them an unpayable debt. Rage was a live coal in my fist, but something steadier sat below it, patient and practiced. Sitting with that patient thing, I began to count options in my head like beams. Call Marcus, call the lawyer, document everything, insist on them leaving tonight. They had come with plans to live in my house as if possession were already theirs, and that was a war I had not planned to fight with fists but with a voice that would be new to them, a voice that understood the language of boundaries and consequences. For a long beat, all I could do was breathe through the hollow that was left when they announced their plans, and in that hush I felt something unfamiliar stir underneath the old panic, a quiet tallying of facts I had kept like tools in a box. I reached for that box without thinking, because when people who have kept you small show up with plans to move into your life, you either run or you inventory. I chose inventory. I opened the shoebox on my spare room dresser where I kept the unsent letters, the single photograph I had hidden for years, and a folded page where I had once written a timeline of things I swore I would not forget. The box smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and when I lifted the lid, something in the room tightened, like a wire pulled to tune. I did not shout. The voice I had practiced into existence did not need volume to carry. I held up the photographs first because pictures are blunt instruments. There was one from when I was 12, and my cheek was bruised in a way that did not line up with the story my parents had told the school. I remember the day, the November sun through the kitchen window, the excuse they used about me falling down the basement stairs. I said the words slowly, each one like a chisel. You told the school I fell down the stairs. You told the guidance counselor I tripped. You told anyone who asked that I was clumsy. The mother who had always smiled at neighbors smiled now like an act and said, "We were worried," as if concern erased the mark on my face. I held the photograph until the color of their lie could be seen against its edges. Then I read from the letters. I read the sentences I had never sent because back then I believed silence might change things. I read the night I slept on the stoop because I refused to apologize for something I had not done. I read the Thursday when my father took my bike and said it was because I deserved to learn responsibility. I read the day my mother told me no one would ever love me if I did not learn to swallow myself whole. I did not embellish. I said dates: summer before ninth grade, the winter he came in drunk on my birthday, and names of witnesses who had called once when they could not stand the sound. I pulled up a printout of a school counselor's note I had kept, a blunt line that recorded a visit where my mother said I had fallen into the coffee table. They had called it an accident. The note called it a pattern. My father tried to interrupt me to make the old noise that meant silence was coming. I let him finish, then pointed to the scar on my forearm that puckered where his hand had gripped me when I tried to run down the hallway as a teen. I had never shown them the exact place I kept that story, but I held my sleeve back and let the light catch it. "You called that discipline," I said. "You called it love. You told me my fear was weakness." When my mother laughed like it was clever, I read aloud from the transcript of an answering machine message an old neighbor had recorded for me before I left. A woman who had once hidden me behind her dog and then later told me to go for good. The neighbor's voice, stuttering with age and the memory of it, said she had called child services because my father had gone too far. They had told the social worker that I was a liar. Those records were in a file I had kept not to punish, but to keep the truth steady. They tried the old tactic of reframing, saying we were tired and it was all in the past. I answered with specifics that could not be softened by good intentions. The night they moved my childhood trophy case into the garage and told me I was ungrateful for leaving them, the night my mother's hand smacked the plates out of my grip because I had friends she did not like, the week I missed 3 days of school because my stomach hurt from staying quiet, those were not stories you could tidy into pity. I named landlords who had seen my wounds and shrugged, teachers who had called and been told I was dramatic. I named their precise words: "No one will ever want you," because language is a chain and I wanted to show them every link they had forged. They flinched. The first time I saw my mother's practiced softness crack, it was like watching plaster fall from a wall to show the rotten wood beneath. My father's face, which had been ironclad with contempt, melted into a scramble of excuses. Denial came like a reflex. "You remember wrong, we never said that," but the sound had nothing behind it. It was thin and small, like paper in the wind. I laid down the last of my proofs, the unsent letters with my handwriting, the counselor's note, the photograph, and the dates I had documented in a journal when I first left. I told them I had kept these things not to trap them but to remember why I had walked away. I told them I had built a life on that reason. When I was done, I did not cry. My voice had a chill to it that made the room feel legal in a way their petty lies could not touch. I told them then, plainly, that I would not be manipulated into sharing a roof with people who had practiced breaking me like a habit. I told them I would not let them set up a system where my care was manufactured into obligation. I told them I would call the local authorities if they refused to leave, and that I had already started a list of actions I would take to protect my home. I watched their sky of entitlement do what roofs do when the joists are cut. Sag. My father reached for the old line about family, but the word family had lost its room to move after I had filled the air with particulars. In the quiet that followed, I felt something else settle into my chest, not victory like fireworks but a steadier warmth, like a hand placed over a wound to let it heal. For the first time in my life, I could see the shape of a future that did not include reparations to the people who had never given me a foundation. I had found the voice they never let me have, and it did not need fury to be right. It only needed truth, laid out exactly where they could not deny it, and the willingness to do what had to be done next. When the evidence landed in the room like cold steel, the careful act they had rehearsed folded in on itself the way rotten paper does in rain. My mother's eyes sharpened until they were thin slits, her smile gone like someone had switched the lights. My father's jaw worked so hard I could see the veins, and the patient calm he had worn like a coat tore as if someone had cut the seams. For a moment they looked like strangers who had been asked to account for someone else's crimes. Then the old thing returned, the tone that had once made me small, the voice that had been used to order me into corners. It came out like a bark from two animals seeing their territory threatened. My father was first to show his teeth. He slammed a palm onto the table so hard the little carved bowl jumped and the dog yelped. Then he leaned forward and said, in that low, dangerous rasp I had heard dozens of times in my childhood, "Do you think you can throw us out like common trash?" He spat the words as if saying them made them true. He started listing imagined offenses I might commit if I forced them out: assault, theft, cruelty, then switched to public threats. He would call my contractor contacts, he said, and tell them I was unstable. He would spread stories to old neighbors, to people in the union, say I was violent, say I was mentally ill. The aim was obvious, to make me fear losing everything I had rebuilt. It was a map of punishment laid out in threats. My mother's weapon was different and older. She crumpled into theatrical sobs that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and perfume, the kind of performance designed to press every one of my guilt buttons. "If you make us leave," she said between wet breaths, "who will check on us? What will happen to us?" She reached for my knee like a child and then twisted, as if trying to make the touch an obligation. She called on our so-called shared history with a slow demand for pity. "We gave you a roof once," she said. "You owe your parents." When that didn't bend me, she moved to the next level, threat of self-destruction. "If you are so cold," he added softly, "she might not make it," and the room tilted in the direction those words always aimed, to make me carry responsibility for another person's choices. Their emotional blackmail was vintage, a tool honed over years when it had always worked. They also tried the social smear. My father grabbed my phone off the table and threatened to post things about my private life online if I didn't comply. He dug into my closet for a jacket and held up a receipt from a place I had once been embarrassed to be seen, as if exposure would shame me into submission. He talked about lawyers and visits from the authorities he claimed to know, about bringing my mental health into question to take advantage of the pity system they'd stage. They spoke as if documentation alone could overturn my proof, as if a handful of loud accusations could drown out the files I had kept. Their threats were scattershot but meant to create doubt in the only currency they had: reputation. There was a moment where I could feel the old panic bubbling, a remembered itch to apologize until the noise stopped. But I had practiced this voice too many nights to let it go. I reached into the shoebox where I kept my records and pulled out a list of dates, names, and the phone numbers of people who would verify the things I said. I told them flatly that I had recorded this conversation for my lawyer and for the police, and that I would not be blackmailed. The words landed like a new kind of furniture in the room, cold, immovable. My father's smile went thin and animal, my mother's hands trembled like she might drop the theatrical mask. They understood suddenly and clearly that their old tricks required an audience that could be shamed and silenced, and the audience was gone. Their rage tried a final move that was physical and clumsy. My father reached across the table to grab the photograph I had propped up, to tear it, to remove an anchor. The dog snapped at his hand and my neighbor's cat skittered under a chair. My reflexes, trained by years of building things and by the memory of being shoved around, were quick. I stepped in between them and the little pile of my life and said calmly, "Stop, leave tonight or I call the police." No bargaining, no guilt. The calm steadiness in my voice was not weakness. It was the response of a man who had rehearsed his boundaries until they were like knuckles. When I said it, something like exhaustion, not theirs but mine, washed over the room. My mother screamed then, a split high sound that carried the practiced hurt she had wielded for decades. My father cursed and called me ungrateful, and then in a last ugly burst accused me of being a liar and a thief for leaving them in the first place. They hurled names that once hurt me, the old vocabulary of shame, hoping the words would land because the wounds were old. They used phrases that were designed to trigger me, but they were hollow now because I had attached evidence to memory and because the people who mattered knew my truth. Their threats sounded like a child trying to frighten a grown man with a broken whistle. The more violent their language became, the smaller they looked, as if rage had shrunk them. Between their tirade and the ring of the porch light, something definitive happened. They exhausted themselves into a kind of small, defeated fury. They paced the living room like storm refugees in someone else's war, throwing accusations like loose change. I watched their breath, the animal panic behind the threats, and I felt no pity for them in that instant, only the cold clarity of a person who knew what had to come next. I locked my jaw and rehearsed the next calls in my head. Marcus, the lawyer, the non-emergency line, and a neighbor I trusted. Their rage had returned them to themselves and exposed everything they wanted to hide, and I realized with a strange relief that the person they expected, me, on bended knee begging forgiveness, was nowhere inside me anymore. I stood in the middle of my living room with my shoebox open and a stack of papers in my hand and felt like a jury that had just come back with a verdict. The room hummed with the low electricity of someone who had finally named their truth aloud. My parents, who until a few breaths earlier had been trying to install themselves into my life like furniture, were pacing the way exhausted animals pace when their den has been found out. They demanded another chance like a habit, all pleading and accusations, and when the pleading failed they sharpened into threats that sounded thin under the weight of the documents I had laid on the table. I set the shoebox down gently and said, "One more time, leave, tonight. If you do not, I will call the police. If you ever contact me again, I will involve the police." The words were not loud, they were precise, like a cut made with a new plane. My father scoffed as if I had threatened to wipe the sky, and my mother folded herself into a theatrical collapse on the couch, sighing at the unfairness of a world that would not rearrange itself for them. My father reached for the photograph on the shelf like a coward trying to take back what had been exposed. But Marcus, who had arrived 3 minutes earlier and who stood in the doorway with his arms folded, and a look that said he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, moved between him and the shelf like a bouncer with a soft heart. Marcus had driven over because I texted one word now, and because he knows me. He knows how silence used to save other people from trouble and cost me everything. He smoked his cigarette outside on the porch, and later tossed it in the planter like a punctuation mark. I asked them to gather their things and go to the motel down the road or to the shelter the city had a number for. They hemmed and hawed and invented reasons like people invent excuses for rain. When the hem and haw turned to stubborn feet and my front step became a place to resist, I called Sam. Sam used to work security for a hospital and had been my neighbor when I first bought the house. He answered my call in a minute and showed up 10 after with a jacket that said security in faded letters and a voice like someone who had learned how to use presence instead of power. I told him everything in a few clipped sentences and he looked at me, really looked, and said, "We get them to the curb and we keep it legal." I like him for that, he spoke like a plan. What followed was the most ordinary kind of righteous action possible. Sam asked them politely to gather their things and leave. Marcus filmed the interaction discreetly on his phone for evidence because we both knew how quickly memory could be remade by the people who had been practicing artful revision for decades. My mother tried the performance again, sobs and the "how will we manage," then tried tempering with indignation when it did not work. My father muttered about calling people he knew, which was the oldest threat in their worn book. Sam looked at him and said, "Look, sir, we are not looking for trouble. You came uninvited and you need to leave." The firmness in Sam's tone was an instruction to gravity itself. When my mother refused to budge, I did something that felt like a ceremony. I walked to the spare room, picked up the mattress they had planted like a flag and carried it to the front porch. It was awkward for me to move something that represented both my torment and their presumption, and the effort made the moment real. I put it on the porch, sat across from it on the step, and watched their faces change. People who have lived on the sharp side of entitlement become small when the world refuses to accommodate them. They pack slowly, like grief taking its time, and I watched their hands collect the parts of a life they claimed as owed. Marcus walked them to the car with Sam 2 steps behind, and my father muttered curses that faded into the night like a bad song. They stopped on the sidewalk and my mother turned and said, "You will regret this." It was meant to be a weapon. It landed like a tired coin. I did not answer. I had nothing to barter with and no appetite for the old games. When their taillights disappeared, I stood on the porch with the mattress behind me and felt the first real exhale I had taken all night. The house felt large in a good way, the way a healed place stretches after the removal of a tumor. I closed the door and locked it, and then I locked it again in a way that was ritualistic and practical both. I called a locksmith I trusted, a man I had hired years ago to fit my first deadbolt, and I told him I needed the highest grade he could recommend. While the locksmith worked, I sat at my table and made calls on a list I had prepared like an army marshal making notes. I filed a police report for trespassing and harassment, not because I wanted to punish so much as to document. I called the local courthouse and learned how to file for a restraining order. The clerk on the other end of the line gave me instructions that were clear and human. I emailed my contractor list with a short note explaining that my parents were trying to contact me and to ignore any calls that sounded like pressure. I wrote an account of the night and attached scanned copies of the dated letters, the counselor's note, the photograph, and the messages I had received in the last hour. Marcus sat at my kitchen table and ate stale chips and told me stupid jokes to make me laugh, and I let him because laughter is a stitch. When the locksmith finished and the new deadbolt clicked into place, the sound felt like an exhale I could own. I turned the key twice and felt the mechanism engage like a promise. It was not a dramatic victory with drums and applause. It was a private, exacting act, the wood yielding to new iron, the house recognizing a new rule. I placed the shoebox back into the top drawer of the dresser in the spare room and pushed the mattress back onto the porch to be collected by a charity arrangement I had already called. I sat on my living room floor with the dog's head on my knee and let the ordinary smells of cedar and coffee fill my lungs. I am not naive about what might come next. They could try to contact me to send mail, to pull on the neighbor's sympathies, to call and lie. But I have lines drawn now that are not going to be shifted by the kinds of people who learn to navigate shame as an instrument. If they call, they will find a phone that records and a man who will call the police. If they show up at the door, they will find it locked and Sam on the other side of a number I keep on speed dial. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the simplest truth. I had defended the house I had built with my hands and the life I had built with my choices, and that was enough.